"Pick it up," he said. "Princess." The black belt hit the floor beside a puddle of spilled soda. Her father's name was stitched into it. The whole dining hall laughed. She didn't laugh. She didn't cry either. She knelt down, lifted it, wiped it clean against her sleeve, and folded it exactly the way he'd taught her when she was 4 years old. Then she looked up at him and said 8 words that nobody in that room ever forgot. "I'm not looking for trouble, but I don't run." 3 weeks later, in a disciplinary hearing, in front of 5 board members and a room full of witnesses, that same young man would swing a closed fist at her face. He thought she was a scared 18-year-old freshman with no money and no family name. He had no idea she'd trained in karate for 16 years.
Every college campus has a first day that feels like a beginning. For Adeline Holloway, it felt more like a test nobody had warned her about. She stood outside the dining hall at Ashworth University with a tray in her hands. Turkey sandwich, an apple, a small carton of milk. Nothing fancy, nothing worth remembering. But some days aren't about what you're carrying. They're about who happens to be watching you carry it. Addie was 18 years old, small frame, quiet eyes, hair pulled back in a simple braid. She looked like any other freshman trying to find her footing in a place full of strangers. That was exactly the point. She wanted to blend in. She didn't want anyone to look twice. Not yet, anyway. The dining hall buzzed with new voices and new laughter. Chairs scraped against tile, trays clattered. Somewhere near the drink station, someone had already dropped a full plate of pasta, and a small crowd was laughing about it, the good-natured kind of laughing that happens when everyone is still new enough to feel forgiving toward each other. Everyone was still learning each other's names. Everyone was still figuring out where they belonged in this new world. Addie found an empty table by the window and sat down. Outside, the trees along the quad had just begun to turn the first hints of orange creeping into the edges of the leaves. She unwrapped her sandwich. For one small moment, everything felt ordinary. She thought about her father the way she often did in quiet moments like this one. He would have liked this place, she thought. The old brick buildings, the wide-open quad. He'd always told her that colleges were built to look like they had something to prove, the way old churches did, the way courthouses did. Buildings meant to remind you that something important was happening inside them. She missed him in a way that had settled over the years into something she could carry without it knocking her over. It didn't announce itself the way it used to. It just sat there quietly, the way an old ache sits in a joint on a cold morning. Then the laughter across the room changed. It got louder, sharper. The kind of laughter that isn't really about a joke. It's about an audience. She looked up. A group of young men crossed the dining hall, and one of them walked like he owned the floor beneath his feet. Tall, broad shoulders, a varsity jacket with the school's crest stitched over his heart. His name was Dawson Sinclair, Jr., though most people just called him Sinclair, the way you'd say the name of a king. His father sat on the university's board of trustees. The family name was carved into stone above the library entrance, gold lettering catching the afternoon light every day at exactly the same angle, as if even the sun had been arranged to flatter it. Everyone on campus knew who Dawson was, even freshmen, who'd only unpacked their bags 3 days earlier. His photo had been in the campus newspaper twice already that week, once for basketball, once for a fundraiser his family had hosted. Dawson spotted Addie sitting alone. That was all it took. "New girl," he said loud enough for half the room to hear. "You look lost." Addie didn't answer. She kept her eyes on her food. That, it turned out, was the wrong move. Dawson stepped closer, his friends trailing behind him like they were waiting for a show to start. There were 3 of them. A tall one with a buzz cut who laughed at everything Dawson said half a beat before it was actually funny. A shorter, wiry one who kept glancing around the room, checking who was watching. And a third, quieter one, hanging back a little, the way people do when they aren't sure they want to be part of what's about to happen but haven't figured out how to leave. "I'm talking to you," Dawson said. "That's rude, ignoring people. Didn't your parents teach you manners?" A few students glanced over, then looked away fast. Nobody wanted trouble on day 3. "I'm just eating lunch," Addie said. Her voice was quiet, Level, not scared, not defiant, just plain. Dawson smiled like he'd found something interesting. "Just eating lunch," he repeated, mocking her tone, drawing the words out in a high, thin voice that made his friends laugh. "You hear that? Little freshman thinks she can sit here and mind her own business." He reached for the strap of her backpack resting against the chair and yanked it up before she could stop him. The bag tipped. A notebook slid out, landing open on the floor, pages fanning. A pen rolled off the table and under a neighboring chair. And something small, wrapped in dark fabric, tumbled onto the floor near his shoe. Dawson bent down and picked it up. It was a belt, black, faded along the edges from years of use, the fabric worn soft in the places where it had been tied and untied 10,000 times. Stitched into the cloth in careful, worn thread that had gone slightly gray with age were 2 words, D. Holloway. He turned it over in his hands, studying it like a joke he hadn't gotten yet. "What is this?" he said, holding it up for his friends. "Some kind of toy?" Addie stood up, not fast, not sharp, just up, the way a person rises when something finally matters enough to leave the chair for it. "That's my father's," she said. "Can I have it back, please?" Something in her voice bothered him more than any anger could have. He held the belt just out of reach, dangling it like bait, watching her face for the flicker of desperation he expected to see. It didn't come. "Your father's," he said, drawing the words out. "Let me guess. Backyard karate class, strip mall dojo. Did he give you a little participation trophy too?" His friends laughed louder. More heads turned. The dining hall was starting to notice the way a room notices weather changing, a subtle shift in pressure before anyone says a word about it. Addie kept her hand out. "Please," she said again, still even, still plain. Dawson's smile faded into something colder. "You know what?" he said. "I don't think you get it. This is my school. My family's name is on half the buildings here. My dad's on the board. You know what that means? It means people here answer to us. And you," he pointed the belt at her, "you're nobody. Some scholarship freshman with a hand-me-down towel." Then he dropped it. Not into her hand. Onto the floor, near a puddle of spilled soda someone had left from lunch, where it landed with a soft, sorry thud, one corner darkening instantly where it touched the liquid. "Pick it up," he said. "Princess." The word hung there, princess. Said the way some people say it when they mean the opposite. When they mean small and easy to laugh at and not worth taking seriously. The whole table roared now. A few strangers at nearby tables chuckled too, mostly out of relief it wasn't happening to them, the particular relief of bystanders who know somewhere under the laughing that they're glad to be somewhere else in the story. Addie didn't laugh. She didn't cry either. She knelt down unhurried and lifted the belt off the floor. The soda had soaked into one end, and she could feel the stickiness of it against her fingers. She wiped it against her sleeve gently, the way you'd clean something you loved, something that had touched skin you missed every single day. Then she folded it careful, and exact the same fold her father had taught her when she was small enough that the belt used to wrap around her twice, and tucked it back into her bag. She stood and looked at him. Nobody said anything for a moment. Even Dawson's friends seemed to be waiting to see what would happen next, the way a crowd waits after a firework fails to go off, unsure if the show is over or just delayed. Then she spoke, and though her voice was quiet, it carried across the whole table. "I'm not looking for trouble," she said, "but I don't run from it either." Dawson blinked, caught off guard. Whatever he expected her to say, it wasn't that. He'd expected tears or anger or some kind of scramble to please him. He hadn't expected calm. He recovered fast, forcing a laugh, glancing sideways at his friends to make sure they were still with him. Big words for someone who can't even hold on to her own backpack. He turned away, shaking his head like she'd said something ridiculous. "Let's go. This is boring me." They walked off, still laughing, already moving on to whatever came next in their day, the way people move on from things that never really cost them anything. Addie sat back down. Her hands stayed loose. Her breathing stayed even on the surface. But her heart, if you'd asked her, was working harder than it looked from the outside. The way a swimmer's legs work hard beneath water that looks perfectly calm. She finished lunch in silence. Nobody came to check on her. Almost nobody. Near the entrance, by the door that led out toward the quad, an older man in a security uniform had watched the whole thing. His name was Walt Higgins, 62 years old, a retired police officer who'd taken the campus job after his wife passed, mostly because sitting home alone had started to feel worse than working. His daughter, who lived 3 states away and called every Sunday evening without fail, had suggested the job after watching her father rattle around an empty house for 2 years, fixing things that didn't need fixing, mowing a lawn that was already short. "Get out of the house, Dad," she'd told him. "Find somewhere to be useful." So he had. Walt had seen plenty of bullying over the years, both on the job and off it. Schoolyard stuff, parking lot stuff. He could spot it from 50 feet away, the way some men sense rain coming before a single cloud shows up. Some old instinct built from decades of watching people's shoulders and hands more than their faces. But what caught his attention that afternoon wasn't Dawson. He'd pegged that one the first week of the semester, watching him swagger through the quad like the sidewalk owed him something. A boy who mistook his father's money for his own worth. Walt had met 100 versions of that boy over his career, and they all eventually learned the same lesson, usually the hard way. What caught his attention was the girl. The way she'd stood up, not fast, not scared. The way she kept her hands loose instead of balling them into fists. The way her eyes tracked Dawson's every move, unshaken, like she was reading him instead of fearing him. Most people her age, faced with that kind of humiliation in front of a crowded room, either froze up or lashed out. She'd done neither. Walt had spent 30 years learning to read people under pressure. It was, in the end, the only skill from that career that had never really left him, the way some men keep their handshake strong long after their bodies have softened everywhere else. What he saw in her wasn't panic. It was patience. He made a small note in his head. Nothing official, just something to keep an eye on. He had no idea yet how right he was to notice. Addie's dorm room sat on the 3rd floor of Whitfield Hall, a narrow building with thin walls and a radiator that clanked every night around 10, loud enough that the resident advisor had put a laminated sign in the stairwell, apologizing for it and promising maintenance would get to it eventually. Her roommate, Junie Whitfield, no relation to the building despite the coincidence, which she brought up at least once a week as though it might eventually stop being funny, was already there when Addie walked in, unpacking a box of sweaters onto a shelf. Junie was bright, talkative, the kind of person who filled silence before it had a chance to feel awkward. She had grown up outside Columbus, the youngest of 4 sisters, and she talked about her family the way some people talk about a favorite television show, with total, easy affection and 100 small details ready at all times. She looked up when Addie walked in and immediately noticed something was off. "You okay?" Junie asked, setting down a folded cardigan. "You look like you saw a ghost." "I'm fine," Addie said, setting her backpack down with care. More care than the bag really required. Junie wasn't convinced, but she let it go. For now. She had learned in just a few short days of living with Addie that her roommate wasn't the type to be pushed into talking before she was ready. That night, after the lights went out, Junie spoke into the dark. "I heard something happened at lunch," she said, "with Sinclair." Addie was quiet a moment. "Word travels fast." "This campus is small," Junie said. "Everything travels fast." A pause, the mattress creaking as she shifted onto her side. "Are you really okay?" "I'm fine," Addie said again, then softer into the dark where it was somehow easier to say true things. "It's not the first time someone's tried to make me feel small." Junie propped herself up on one elbow, though it was too dark to see her roommate's face. "What do you mean?" Addie didn't answer that. She just said, "Get some sleep. Classes start early." Junie let it drop, but she lay awake longer than usual, turning over the phrase, "not the first time," like it held a whole story folded up somewhere behind it. The same way that belt had been folded up in Addie's bag. The days that followed settled into the ordinary rhythm of freshman year. Classes, orientation meetings, Long lines at the bookstore where the cashier ran out of the correct edition of the economics textbook twice in one afternoon. Addie mostly kept to herself not out of unfriendliness, but out of habit. She moved through the world with care, the way someone does when they've learned attention isn't always a gift. 3 afternoons a week, she walked 20 minutes off campus to a small diner called The Wayside, where she'd taken a job waiting tables to help cover the costs her scholarship didn't quite reach. The owner, a heavy-set, kind-faced man named Frank Delaney, had hired her the first week of the semester after she'd walked in and simply asked plainly if he needed help. He liked that about her. Most students who came in looking for work spent 5 minutes talking about their qualifications before getting to the point. "You're a hard worker," Frank told her that first week, watching her clear a table of dishes without being asked twice. "I can always tell. Some people carry themselves like they're doing you a favor showing up. You don't. My dad taught me that," Addie said. "Show up like the job matters, even if it's just carrying plates." Frank had chuckled at that, the kind of low, easy laugh that made the whole diner feel a little warmer. "Smart man," he said. Thursday afternoon, before her shift at the Wayside, Addie wandered the club fair that had taken over the quad tables lining both sides of the wide gravel path. Each one promoting something different. Debate club, choir, intramural soccer, run by 2 upperclassmen who seemed more interested in recruiting friends than players. Junie had already signed up for 4 clubs she would almost certainly never attend, mostly because the free stickers at each table were too good to pass up. Near the end of the row, under a slightly faded banner that read Ashworth Karate Club in block letters, stood a table with a stack of flyers and a small folding chair. Addie stopped. She hadn't planned to. Her feet just carried her there, the way old habits sometimes make decisions before the rest of you catches up. Behind the table stood a man in his 50s, gray at the temples, built solid in the way of someone who still trained long after his competitive years had passed. The kind of build that came from decades of discipline rather than a gym membership picked up in January. His name, printed on a small folded card propped against a stack of flyers, was Coach Daniel Reeves. He was talking to another student, a lanky sophomore, asking about belt requirements, but something about the way Addie stood a few feet back, patient, waiting her turn without hovering, caught his eye mid-sentence. He finished with the sophomore and turned to her. "Interested in the club?" he asked. "Maybe," Addie said. "Just looking." Reeves studied her a moment longer than the question required, the way a man studies something familiar from an angle he can't quite place. "You've trained before?" he said, not really a question. Addie hesitated. "A little." "How long?" "A while," she said, sidestepping the question the way she'd sidestepped it 100 times before with people who wouldn't understand the answer anyway. Reeves smiled slightly, the way a man smiles when he recognizes modesty and not dishonesty. The two things easy to confuse from the outside, but never from the inside. "Well," he said, "if you ever want to come by practice, we meet Tuesdays and Thursdays, 6 o'clock in the West Gym. No pressure. Come watch first if you want." Addie thanked him and turned to go, but as she did, Reeves called after her. "Can I ask your name?" "Addie," she said. "Addie Holloway." Something crossed his face, just for a second, gone almost as fast as it arrived, like a name had landed somewhere it wasn't expected. "Holloway," he repeated quietly, almost to himself. "Yes," she said, not noticing the shift already half-turned toward the next row of tables. "Well, Addie Holloway," Reeves said, recovering his easy smile, "I hope to see you at practice." She nodded and walked off into the crowd, weaving between tables toward the diner where her shift started in 20 minutes. Reeves stood there a while longer, watching her go, a stack of unclaimed flyers fluttering slightly in the afternoon breeze beside him. His mind had been pulled somewhere far from the club fair, somewhere 20 years in the past, to a mat in a small gym 2 states over, to a partner who used to call him Slowpoke every time Reeves lost a step during sparring, to a friendship he hadn't thought about this clearly in a long while. He told himself it was probably nothing, a common enough name, coincidences happened. But some part of him didn't believe that, not really, and he found himself thinking about her the rest of the afternoon, in the gaps between conversations with other students who stopped by the table. That evening, Junie found a photograph while helping Addie sort through a box of books that hadn't fit on the shelf, both of them kneeling on the dorm room floor amid a small landslide of paperbacks. It slipped out from between 2 pages of an old paperback, an old, slightly bent picture of a young girl in a white karate uniform standing beside a man in a police uniform. His hand rested proudly on her shoulder, and both of them were squinting slightly into whatever sun had been shining that day. "Is this you?" Junie asked, holding it up carefully by the edges. Addie took it gently. "Yeah," she said, a small smile tugging at her mouth despite herself. "I was 6. That was right after my first belt test." "And this is your dad?" Addie nodded, her thumb brushing the edge of the photo, tracing the outline of his shoulder, like she could still feel the weight of his hand there. "He taught me karate. Started when I was 2, if you can believe that. Baby steps, literally." Junie laughed at that, a genuine laugh. "That's sweet. Does he still teach?" There was a small pause, the kind that changes the temperature of a room without anyone touching the thermostat. "He passed away," Addie said, "a few years ago." Junie's smile fell instantly. "Oh, I'm so sorry, Addie. I didn't mean to." "It's okay," Addie said, and she meant it, in the careful way people mean things they've practiced saying many times, smoothing the edges of a grief so it doesn't cut whoever's listening. "He was a good man. Everyone in our town knew him. He was a police officer for years, and before that other work too. He taught karate for free to kids who couldn't afford lessons, ran the classes out of the community center on weekends. He believed discipline shouldn't only belong to people who could pay for it." Junie sat back on her heels, listening, the box of books forgotten between them. "He used to tell me something," Addie went on, her voice a little lower now, the way voices go when they're reaching backward for something. "He said the belt isn't about being strong enough to hurt someone. It's about knowing you could and choosing something better instead." The room went quiet for a moment, just the sound of the radiator ticking as it cooled. "So today," Junie said carefully, "when that guy threw your belt on the floor—" "I know what it stands for," Addie said. "That's why I didn't let it stay there." Junie looked at her roommate with new eyes, not pity, something closer to respect, the kind that comes from finally understanding why someone stayed so calm when calm seemed like the hardest possible choice. "You could have decked him, couldn't you?" she asked, half joking, half not, watching Addie's face carefully for the answer. Addie almost smiled. "Probably," she said, "but that's not what my dad taught this belt to do." She tucked the photograph into a small wooden box on her desk, the kind with a simple brass clasp, and set it down next to the folded black belt before closing the lid. Junie watched her do it, and something about the ritual of it, careful and unhurried, told her more about her roommate than any explanation could have. News about the dining hall spread the way these things always do on a small campus, twisted a little more with each telling, gaining details the way a snowball gains snow. By Friday, some versions had Addie crying and begging for her bag back, tears streaming down her face in front of the whole room. Other versions had her screaming at Dawson, cursing him out, which was even further from the truth than the crying version. Dawson didn't correct any of it. He seemed to enjoy the attention retelling the story in a way that made himself sound clever and her sound pathetic, embellishing a little more each time until the story barely resembled what had actually happened. "She was practically in tears," he told a group of teammates in the locker room, though none of them had actually seen it happen. "Some scholarship kid who thinks she's tough because her daddy taught her a few kicks." His friends laughed along the way friends do when laughing feels safer than asking questions, when going along with the group is easier than standing apart from it, even for something small. But not everyone laughed. A freshman named Peter Doyle, one of the newer players on the basketball team, sat quietly on the bench, lacing his shoes, saying nothing. He'd actually been in the dining hall that day, seated 2 tables away, close enough to see and hear everything clearly. He remembered it differently. He remembered the girl not crying at all. He remembered her standing there unbothered, almost strangely so, saying something about not running from trouble. At the time, he'd thought it was odd how unafraid she seemed, how her voice hadn't shaken even a little. He'd actually admired it quietly, the way you admire something you know you couldn't do yourself. But Peter didn't say anything. Questioning Dawson Sinclair Jr. wasn't something freshmen on the team did, not if they wanted a spot in the starting lineup come November. Not if they wanted their scholarship renewed without complications. He laced his shoes a little tighter than necessary and kept his eyes down. Silence sometimes isn't cruelty. Sometimes it's just fear wearing a quieter coat. By the following Monday, isolation had crept in around Addie, small but unmistakable the way frost creeps across a window overnight without anyone noticing the exact moment it started. A few girls on her floor who'd been friendly the first week now offered only thin smiles in the hallway conversations that ended a beat too quickly. A study group for her economics class quietly stopped including her in messages, the group chat notification simply absent from her phone one morning, where it had been there the week before. Nothing dramatic. No one confronted her outright. It was smaller than that, and somehow harder to fight, because there was nothing to point to, nothing to name. It was the sound of doors closing softly, one by one, until she noticed she was standing outside most of them. Junie noticed too. Junie always noticed. "This isn't right," she said, one night sitting cross-legged on her bed while Addie studied at the small desk between them, a chemistry textbook open in front of her that she hadn't turned a page of in 10 minutes. "People are being weird because of some rumor Sinclair's spreading. Melissa from down the hall practically ran the other way today when I mentioned your name." "I know," Addie said, not looking up from her textbook. "Aren't you mad?" Addie thought about the question, honestly setting her pen down. "I'm frustrated," she said, "but mad doesn't usually help." "How are you not losing it right now?" Junie asked, genuinely curious, not accusing. "If it were me, I'd have snapped by now. I'd have gone and told that whole table exactly what I thought of them." Addie closed her book. "My dad used to say something," she said. "He said, anger is like holding a hot coal, waiting to throw it at someone. You're the one who gets burned first." Junie let that sit, turning it over. "Your dad sounds like he was a wise guy." "He was," Addie said softly. "I miss him every day." A pause settled over the room, comfortable, not heavy. "Can I ask what happened to him?" Junie said gently. "You don't have to answer if you don't want to." Addie glanced at the small wooden box on her desk, its brass clasp catching the lamplight. "There was an incident," she said carefully, "a while back. He was helping people during a bad situation and he didn't make it out. The whole town still talks about it. He's kind of a big deal back home, believe it or not." "I believe it," Junie said. "I can tell." Addie managed a small smile. "Anyway," she said, "that's enough sad stuff for one night. I have a chemistry quiz tomorrow I haven't touched, and Professor Elling doesn't do curves." Junie let the conversation rest there, sensing Addie had shared about as much as she was ready to share for one evening. But something had shifted in how she saw her roommate. She understood now that Addie wasn't just quiet. She was carrying something. Carefully. The way you carry something you've learned never to drop. That Wednesday night, Addie called her mother. She sat on the small balcony outside her dorm room, phone against her ear, wrapped in a blanket against the October chill, watching her breath fog faintly in the porch light. "How's school going, sweetheart?" her mother asked, her voice warm and a little tired the way it always sounded after a long shift at the hospital, where she worked as a nurse in the pediatric wing, a job she'd taken up again 2 years after Addie's father died, needing something to fill the hours, needing to be useful to someone, the way Walt Higgins had needed the same thing, though neither of them had ever met. "It's fine," Addie said, "getting used to things." "Just fine." Addie hesitated. "There's this guy," she said. "He's been giving me a hard time. Nothing serious." Her mother's voice sharpened, the way mothers' voices do when they hear those words together. "What kind of hard time?" "He knocked my bag over, threw Dad's belt on the ground." Addie kept her tone light, trying not to worry her. I picked it up. It's fine. A long pause on the line, the kind that carries its own weight. You didn't do anything, did you? Her mother finally asked. Not angry. Careful the way a person asks a question they're afraid of the answer to. No, Mom, Addie said. I remembered what we talked about. Her mother let out a slow breath, one Addie could almost picture her mother's shoulders dropping half an inch the way they always did when relief arrived. Good, she said, because I meant what I said. After everything that happened with your father, I can't. She stopped herself, the sentence left unfinished the way it always was whenever she got close to that particular edge. I know, Mom, Addie said gently. I promised you. I'm not going to use my hands to solve problems, not unless I have to protect myself or someone else. That's right, her mother said. Your father believed in that too. That belt isn't a weapon, Addie, it's a promise. I remember, Addie said quietly, looking out at the campus lights scattered across the dark like something spilled and left to settle. They talked a while longer about small things, classes, the weather turning colder, whether Addie was eating enough, a question her mother asked every single call without fail. But after they hung up, she sat on the balcony a long time, watching lit windows across campus, thinking about promises and about the kind of strength that never announces itself. She thought, too, about the night years ago when her mother had first made her promise, sitting at their kitchen table with red-rimmed eyes 3 days after the funeral, holding Addie's hands so tightly it almost hurt. Promise me, her mother had said. Promise me you'll use everything he taught you to protect people. Never to prove something, never out of anger. He didn't die so you could turn into someone who fights first. Addie had been 15 then, and she hadn't fully understood the weight of what she was promising. She understood it now. Somewhere out there, in one of those buildings, Dawson Sinclair Jr. was probably telling the crying freshman story again. He had no idea what he was actually dealing with. The days after brought small, sharp reminders that Dawson hadn't lost interest in his new favorite target. He'd pass her in the quad and mutter something loud enough for his friends to catch something about towels or trophies, the joke never quite landing, but never quite stopping either. He'd knock her shoulder in crowded hallways, always with an exaggerated, hollow apology after the kind that made the offense worse instead of better. Once, in the campus bookstore, he came up behind her in line and asked loudly enough for the cashier to hear whether she needed help carrying her books since she seemed so used to dropping things. A few people near the register laughed. Addie paid for her notebook and left without a word. Addie kept her head down, kept going to class, kept her shifts at the wayside where Frank never asked questions but always seemed to notice when something was sitting heavy on her, sliding an extra basket of fries her way at the end of a shift on the house without comment. And she kept training, alone, in her room at night, slow, deliberate forms that Junie sometimes woke to find moonlight tracing her roommate's careful movements against the wall, silent except for the soft sound of bare feet against the floor. You're really good, Junie whispered one night, waking to find Addie balanced perfectly on one leg, arms extended, utterly still. Like really good. Addie lowered her leg, catching her breath. 16 years of practice, she said. You'd hope so. 16 years? Junie repeated, amazed, sitting up fully now. You started at 2? Started watching at 2, Addie corrected, settling onto the edge of her bed. Started really training around 4. My dad said discipline has to grow with you. You can't rush it. He used to say kids who get pushed too hard too young end up quitting by 13, or worse, they end up using it wrong. Junie pulled her knees up to her chest. So why don't you just, put Sinclair in his place already? You clearly could. One good move and he'd never bother you again. Addie sat with that for a moment, thoughtful. It's not that simple, she said. My dad always told me you can win a fight and still lose everything that matters. What does that even mean? It means, Addie said slowly, choosing her words the way she chose her stances, careful and deliberate. If I hurt him, even if I'm right, even if he deserves it, I become the story. Not him. People forget what he did and just remember that I hit someone. My dad spent his whole life protecting people the right way. I'm not going to throw that away over someone like Dawson Sinclair. Junie was quiet a moment, taking that in, the kind of quiet that meant she was actually thinking rather than waiting for her turn to talk. That's a lot of restraint for an 18-year-old, she finally said. Addie shrugged, pulling her blanket up over her knees. It's a lot of restraint for anyone, she said, but it's the only way I know how to honor him. Junie lay back, staring at the ceiling, the radiator ticking softly in the dark. I hope he gets what's coming to him, she muttered. Someday. Somehow. Addie didn't answer that. She just closed her eyes and let sleep take her with no idea how soon that day would come or how it would finally arrive. By the second week of October, Ashworth's basketball team had its first big win of the preseason, a comfortable victory over a rival school 2 hours south, and the campus buzzed with the kind of energy that follows a Friday night win. Music thumped from the fraternity houses along Beacon Street. Students spilled out of parties into the cool autumn air, laughing, celebrating, feeling invincible the way only the young feel at the start of something new, before the world has had much chance to teach them otherwise. Dawson Sinclair Jr. scored 22 points that night, a career high, and the local sports page had already run a short piece online praising his performance, quoting his coach, calling him a future star. He walked out of the gym like a man who'd already won something bigger than a game, trailing teammates and hangers-on, soaking in every bit of the attention, like a plant finally getting sun after a long stretch of shade. He'd been drinking. Not heavily, but enough to loosen whatever thin restraint usually kept his cruelty behind closed doors, enough that the version of himself walking through campus that night was a little louder, a little looser, a little more willing to act on impulses he might otherwise have kept in check. Junie had gone to a small gathering with girls from her floor, promising Addie she'd be back by midnight. Addie had stayed behind, choosing a quiet night in the library over the noise, working through a stack of reading for her literature seminar, until the building closed at 10. She left just before 10, backpack slung over one shoulder, walking the familiar path back to Whitfield Hall, through the mostly empty lot behind the science building, the shortest route back. The one she'd walked a dozen times already without incident. She wasn't the only one out there that night. Junie, it turned out, had left the gathering early, too tired after a long week cutting through the same lot on her way home, her phone flashlight guiding her steps through the dim October dark, the overhead lot lights flickering weakly, one of them clearly burnt out near the far end. She didn't see Dawson and 2 of his teammates until she was already close enough that turning back would have looked strange, like exactly the kind of fear that might invite more attention rather than less. Well, well, Dawson said, spotting her, his words a little slurred, his grin a little too wide, a little too loose at the edges. If it isn't little Miss Sensitive's roommate. Junie's stomach tightened. I don't want any trouble, she said, trying to walk past, keeping her eyes forward the way she'd been taught since she was young. Never make yourself smaller, never let them see you're scared. Though the advice felt harder to follow than it sounded, now that it actually mattered. But Dawson stepped sideways, blocking her, still grinning, still riding the high of his win and whatever he'd been drinking to celebrate it. Where's your friend tonight? He asked. The karate kid. She let you walk around alone in the dark? Move! Junie said, her voice shaking despite herself, despite every effort to keep it steady. Dawson leaned in closer, his teammates laughing behind him, the kind of laughing that eggs a thing on because nobody wants to be the one who stops it. The kind of laughing that has stopped being about humor entirely and become about momentum, about not wanting to be the friend who ruins the mood. Come on, he said. I'm just being friendly. He reached out and grabbed the strap of Junie's bag the same way he'd grabbed Addie's weeks before, like it had become a habit, a way of proving to himself he could take whatever he wanted from whoever he wanted. A small cruelty that cost him nothing and gave him, in some broken calculation, something that felt like power. Junie stumbled back, frightened, now her voice catching in her throat, one hand instinctively reaching for her phone, though she knew somewhere under the panic that there wasn't time to use it. That was the exact moment Addie rounded the corner of the science building, her own path home cutting directly through the lot, the library books shifting in her bag with every step. She saw it immediately. Dawson's hand on her roommate's bag, Junie's face pale under the flickering lot light. The two teammates laughing like it was all some kind of game, like there was nothing at stake here at all. Something in Addie went very still. Not frozen. Still the way deep water goes still right before something moves beneath the surface, the way a held breath goes still right before it's finally released. "Let her go," Addie said. Her voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Dawson turned, and when he saw who'd spoken, something ugly flickered across his face, something that had been simmering since the dining hall, since a girl he'd tried to humiliate had looked him in the eye instead of crumbling something that had been waiting without him fully realizing it for exactly this kind of opportunity. "Look who it is," he said, releasing Junie's bag, though not out of kindness, more like a predator finding a more interesting target. "Come to save the day, princess?" "Let her go," Addie repeated, stepping between him and her roommate, her voice steady, her weight settling evenly onto both feet without her even thinking about it. 16 years of muscle memory arriving before conscious thought did.
"This has nothing to do with her."
"Addie, don't," Junie whispered, tugging weakly at her sleeve, fear making her voice small. "It's fine, let's just go." But Addie didn't move. Dawson's teammates had gone quiet, sensing something had shifted, something in the air of the parking lot, changing in a way neither of them could quite name, though both of them would later describe it separately as the moment they realized this wasn't going to go the way they'd expected. Dawson stepped closer, the alcohol and the bruised ego, and weeks of unspoken humiliation boiling up together into something reckless, something that had been building since that first afternoon in the dining hall when she hadn't given him the reaction he wanted. "You know," he said, his voice low, almost shaking now, "I'm getting real tired of you acting like you're better than everyone here. Like you're some kind of hero because your dead cop dad taught you a few kicks." The mention of her father landed somewhere deep, somewhere that still had an edge to it even after all these years. But her face didn't change, not even a flicker. "You don't get to talk about my father," she said quietly. "Or what?" Dawson snapped, closing the last bit of distance, his fists clenched, his face inches from hers, close enough that she could smell the alcohol on his breath. "What are you gonna do, huh? Little scholarship freshman standing there like she's tough." Behind him, one of his teammates said, "Dawson, man, let's just go. This isn't worth it." His voice carrying the thin, uneasy edge of someone who could feel a line approaching and didn't want to be standing there when it got crossed. But Dawson wasn't listening anymore. Something in him had crossed a line he hadn't planned on crossing, fueled by pride and liquor, and weeks of a humiliation he refused to admit he'd caused himself, a boy who had never once in his life faced a consequence he couldn't buy his way out of. Standing now in a dark parking lot, about to learn that some things aren't for sale. "You embarrassed me," he said, voice rising, echoing off the lot's concrete walls, "in front of everyone. I'm not letting some nobody talk to me like that." "I never embarrassed you," Addie said, still not raising her voice, still standing between him and Junie, steady as the ground beneath her. "You did that yourself." Something in Dawson's face broke, the last thin thread of restraint snapping loose the way a rope finally gives after fraying quietly for longer than anyone had noticed. "That's it," he said. "Don't cry, princess." His fist came up swinging hard, straight for her face. The same words from that first day in the dining hall now twisted into something far more dangerous, no longer just cruelty meant to humiliate, but a threat, finally acting on itself under the flickering parking lot light, with Junie's scream just beginning to leave her throat, the whole night narrowing down to that single fist and the girl standing calmly in its path. Time slows down in moments like that. People say it afterward, and they're usually right, though nobody can ever fully explain why. It isn't magic. It's the body doing what training built it to do, cutting away everything unnecessary until only the essential thing remains sharp and clear. Addie saw the fist coming. She saw it the way she'd seen 1,000 punches before in a gym back home under fluorescent lights that buzzed faintly overhead, with her father's voice calling out corrections from the mat's edge, patient, even when she got it wrong for the 100th time.
Watch the shoulder, not the hand. The hand lies, the shoulder tells the truth. Dawson's shoulder dropped half a second before his fist moved. That was all the warning she needed. It wasn't even really a decision, the way most people imagine decisions weighed and considered. It was closer to breathing. She shifted her weight, just slightly, just enough. Her head turned, chin tucking the motion so small that anyone watching from a distance might have missed it entirely. His knuckles passed close enough that she felt the wind of it graze her cheek, a strange cold breath of near contact. He missed. Not because she ran, not because she flinched, because she moved exactly the amount she needed to move and not 1 inch more. The force of his own swing carried him half a step forward, off balance for a moment, his fist meeting nothing but cold October air, his whole body lurching after a target that was no longer where it had been a heartbeat earlier. Junie's scream cut off halfway, turning into a stunned gasp, instead both hands flying up to her mouth. Nobody moved for a second. Not Dawson, still hunched forward from the momentum of his own swing. Not his 2 teammates, frozen mid-step. Not Addie, who stood exactly where she'd repositioned herself, her hands still open at her sides, her breathing even. Then she straightened, and she looked at him, her voice low but clear enough to carry across the whole lot. The kind of voice that didn't need volume because it had something better than volume. "You still have a chance to walk away," she said. Dawson stared at her chest, heaving, his face flushed with something between rage and confusion. He hadn't expected to miss. Somewhere in his head, in whatever version of this he'd imagined on the walk over, this was supposed to end with her on the ground, scared, sorry, finally understanding her place the way he understood his own place in every room he'd ever walked into. Instead, she stood there, untouched, waiting to see what he'd do next, her calm somehow more unsettling than any scream could have been. "You're crazy," he said, stumbling back a step, though it was hard to tell whether the stumble came from the alcohol or from something closer to fear, something new and unfamiliar rising in his chest. "You're actually crazy." "I didn't touch you," Addie said. "You should think about that." One of his teammates, a tall boy named Marcus, who'd been quiet the whole time, put a hand on Dawson's shoulder. "Dude, come on," he muttered, glancing nervously toward the dorm buildings in the distance, toward the possibility of someone else walking by and seeing this. "Let's just go. This is done." Dawson shook the hand off, but he didn't swing again. Whatever had just happened seemed to have gotten into him, the way cold water gets into your bones long after you've stepped out of it, a chill that lingers past the moment that caused it. "This isn't over," he said, pointing a finger at her, though his voice had lost some of its heat, some of its certainty. "You'll see what happens when you make me look stupid." Then he turned and walked off, his teammates trailing behind him, throwing uneasy glances back over their shoulders, the 3 of them disappearing into the dark toward the fraternity houses. Their earlier swagger noticeably thinner than it had been 20 minutes before. The lot went quiet again. Just the distant thump of music from Beacon Street and the soft tick of the one working overhead light. Junie was shaking. Addie turned to her at once, the hard edge draining out of her voice and into something softer, something worried. "Hey," she said, taking her roommate's arm gently. "Are you okay? Did he hurt you?" Junie shook her head, though tears had started down her cheeks now, the fear finally catching up to her now that the danger had passed, the way fear so often arrives late to its own party. "No," she said. "No, I'm fine. He grabbed my bag and then you showed up and You're safe," Addie said. "Come on, let's get you inside." They walked back together, Addie's arm around Junie's shoulders the whole way, saying nothing more, letting the quiet do the comforting. Words couldn't quite manage. By the time they reached Whitfield Hall, Junie had stopped shaking, though she held on to Addie's arm a little longer than necessary at the door, unwilling to let go just yet. Neither of them noticed the small red light blinking on the security camera mounted at the corner of the science building, recording everything. The footage capturing the whole exchange in flat, grainy detail that would matter enormously in the days to come. Neither of them noticed,
40 yards off, near the edge of the lot, an old man in a security jacket, standing very still. He'd been walking his evening round when he heard raised voices, and by the time he'd gotten close enough to see clearly, the worst of it had already passed. He'd watched the whole thing unfold, too far to help, close enough to see clearly. Walt Higgins stood there a long moment after they'd gone, turning something over in his mind that felt oddly like recognition, the way a half-remembered song feels when a few notes of it drift by from somewhere else. He'd seen that kind of composure before, a long time ago. In men who'd worn a badge, men he'd trained alongside decades earlier. Men who could stand steady in the middle of chaos because something in them had been built, deliberately, brick by brick, to hold up under exactly that kind of weight. He radioed his supervisor, reported the incident calmly and factually, the way he'd filed 1,000 reports over the years, and made a note to pull the footage first thing in the morning. Something told him, the way it sometimes tells old cops things they can't quite explain, that this story wasn't finished. By Saturday morning, the truth of what happened in that parking lot had already begun to bend the way truth so often does once it passes through the hands of people with something to protect. Dawson woke with a headache and a wounded pride, and somewhere between the aspirin and the shame, lying in his dorm room with the blinds still drawn against the late morning light, he settled on a version of events that made him the victim. It wasn't even really a conscious decision. It was simpler than that. It was just easier to believe. He told his roommate Addie Holloway had attacked him, that she'd come at him with some kind of trained move unprovoked while he was simply walking a friend home after a party. By Sunday, the story had grown teeth, passed from dorm room to dorm room the way stories do on a small campus, gaining weight with every retelling. Now she'd nearly broken his jaw. Now it was some kind of assault against athletes, whatever that was supposed to mean, an idea Dawson himself had apparently invented somewhere between Saturday and Sunday. Now Dawson was the one who'd shown restraint, hadn't fought back, out of respect for a girl, even though she'd apparently tried to hurt him first. A version of events so thoroughly reversed from what had actually happened that it would have been almost funny if it hadn't been so dangerous. It didn't matter that none of it was true. It mattered that Dawson Sinclair Jr. said it, and people believed him, because believing him was easier than questioning a family whose name sat carved above the library entrance in gold letters that caught the morning sun at exactly the right angle to look deliberately like something permanent and true. By Monday morning, Addie had been called to the Dean of Students' office. She sat in the small waiting room outside Dean Prentice's door, hands folded in her lap, trying to steady her breathing, watching the second hand of the wall clock tick its way around in small, precise movements. Junie had wanted to come along, had insisted on it that morning over breakfast, but Addie had asked her to wait outside, not wanting her roommate dragged further into something she hadn't chosen, something that had already cost her enough fear for 1 week. The door opened, and Dean Prentice, a tired-looking woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a stack of paperwork that seemed permanently attached to her desk, the same stack that had apparently grown by another inch since the semester began, waved Addie inside. "Miss Holloway," she said, "please, sit down." Addie sat, smoothing her hands over her knees once before folding them again. "I'll be honest with you," the dean said, folding her own hands, her tone gentle but businesslike, the tone of someone who'd delivered difficult news many times before and had learned there was no kind way to delay it. "A complaint's been filed against you. A serious one." "By Dawson Sinclair," Addie said quietly. "By his father, actually," the dean corrected, glancing down at a paper on her desk. "Mr. Sinclair Sr. called this morning before I had even had my coffee. He's requesting a formal disciplinary hearing." Something tightened in Addie's chest, though her face stayed level, the way she'd trained her face to stay level through years of tournaments where showing fear only fed an opponent's confidence. "What exactly am I being accused of?" The dean glanced down at the paper in front of her. "Assault," she said. "Or attempted assault. The report states you confronted Dawson Jr. in a parking lot Friday night and made a physical attempt to strike him using, quote, martial arts training." "That's not what happened," Addie said, disbelief pressing up under her calm despite her best efforts to keep it down. I understand there may be another side to this, the dean said carefully, her eyes flicking briefly to Addie's clean disciplinary record on the screen in front of her. But given who filed the complaint and given university policy, we're required to hold a formal hearing before the Board of Student Conduct. When? Addie asked. The dean checked her calendar, flipping to a page marked with a yellow tab. Friday afternoon, she said. That gives you 5 days to prepare, gather any witnesses, any evidence. 5 days. Addie sat with the number a moment, feeling it settle over her like a stone dropped into still water, the ripples spreading outward into every part of the coming week. Is there a security camera in that parking lot? She asked. Behind the science building? Dean Prentice nodded slowly. There should be, yes. Campus security keeps footage on file for a rolling period, I believe 30 days. You're welcome to request access as part of your defense. I'd like to, Addie said, as soon as possible. I'll make a note, the dean said, writing something down, her pen scratching against the paper. Then she looked up, her expression softening slightly, some of the formality dropping away. Miss Holloway, for what it's worth, I've read your file. Strong academic record, no prior conduct issues. Glowing note from your high school counselor, actually, which isn't something I see often. I want to believe there's more to this. There is, Addie said quietly. I just have to prove it. Word of the hearing spread fast, the way everything spread on Ashworth's small campus, moving through group chats and dining hall tables and hallway conversations faster than any official announcement ever could. By Tuesday, half the freshman class seemed to know Addie Holloway was facing expulsion for allegedly attacking the basketball team's star player. The other half seemed to know a slightly different story, whispered more carefully, that she'd been defending her roommate, that Dawson had thrown the first punch and missed. Peter Doyle had mentioned it quietly to one other freshman on the team, unable to keep entirely silent after seeing the story twisted so far from what he remembered. But rumors don't carry the same weight as an official complaint filed by a board of trustees member's son, and Peter's small correction barely dented the momentum of the louder, uglier version. Junie was furious, pacing their small dorm room Tuesday night, unable to sit still, her socked feet padding the same 6-foot path over and over between her bed and the window. "This is insane," she said. "He attacked you. I saw it. I'll testify. I'll tell them exactly what happened." "They'll say you're biased," Addie said, sitting at her desk, staring at a blank notebook page she couldn't bring herself to write on, the pen resting untouched beside it. "You're my roommate. They'll say you're just protecting me." "Then what do we do?" Junie asked, frustration cracking her voice, her hands gesturing helplessly. "Just let them kick you out for something you didn't do." Addie closed her eyes for a moment. "I requested the camera footage," she said. "If it's still there, it'll show everything. It'll show I never touched him. And if it's not..." Addie didn't answer that. She didn't want to imagine that possibility yet, though some quiet, cautious part of her had already begun bracing for it anyway. Wednesday morning, Walt Higgins sat at his small desk in the campus security office, sipping lukewarm coffee from a chipped mug that had said, "World's okayest grandpa" on it since his granddaughter gave it to him 3 Christmases ago, staring at a folder he'd pulled from the archive room the night before. He hadn't planned on digging this deep. It had started simply out of habit, pulling the footage request for the Holloway case, cross-checking names against the visitor log the way he always did before handing anything over to the dean's office. Routine paperwork he'd done 100 times without incident. But somewhere along the way, that name, Holloway, had snagged something in the back of his mind. A memory he couldn't quite place, faint and stubborn, the way a word sits on the tip of your tongue for hours before finally surfacing. So, he did what old cops do. He pulled a thread patient the way 30 years on the job had taught him to be patient, understanding that most important things don't reveal themselves quickly. It led him eventually to an old newspaper archive the university library kept on microfilm, tucked away in a back room most students never visited. County records going back years that nobody had digitized yet. He typed the name into the search terminal, half expecting nothing, prepared to feel foolish for wasting his morning. What came up stopped him cold. Local officer honored for bravery in Ridgeview apartment fire.
The article was nearly 15 years old, the photograph grainy, but clear enough printed from a roll of microfilm that had clearly seen better days. A younger man, maybe in his early 30s, stood in front of a burned building, uniform smudged with soot. A group of children and their parents gathered behind him. Several of the children still wrapped in blankets someone had brought from a nearby house. Officer Walter Holloway of the Ridgeview Police Department is credited with rescuing 8 residents, including 6 children, from a third-floor apartment fire early Tuesday morning. Holloway, a father himself, entered the burning structure twice after firefighters were delayed by a downed power line blocking the main road. "He didn't hesitate," said one resident. "He just went in. Twice, like it was nothing." Holloway also serves as a volunteer karate instructor at the Ridgeview Community Center, where he teaches self-defense classes free of charge to local children. Walt sat back, staring at the screen, letting out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. He remembered now, vaguely, a story that had made regional news years back before he'd retired from his own department 2 counties over. A story he'd read once over a cup of coffee, much like the one in front of him now, and never thought about again. A cop who'd run into a burning building not once but twice to save children who weren't even his own, the kind of story that made the rounds at police departments for a week or two, and then faded, the way most good stories eventually do, into the background of everything else that happens in the world. He looked at the small photo again, at the tired, proud smile on the young officer's soot-streaked face. A smile that seemed to say the whole thing had simply been necessary, nothing more. Then he thought of Addie Holloway, standing calm and unshaken in that parking lot Friday night, refusing to throw a punch even when one had been thrown at her, standing the exact same way he now realized that her father must have stood in front of that burning building, weighing what needed to be done against what fear was telling him to do, and choosing the harder thing anyway. Discipline has to grow with you. He didn't know where that thought came from. It just settled into him like something true, something he suddenly understood without needing anyone to explain it. He printed the article, folded it carefully along its original crease, and tucked it into his jacket pocket, patting it once, the way you'd pat a wallet to make sure it was still there. He had a hearing to prepare for, too, in his own way. That same afternoon, Addie walked into the small gymnasium where the karate club held practice, mostly because she needed somewhere quiet to think that wasn't her dorm room where Junie's worry, however well-meaning, had started to feel almost as heavy as her own. Coach Reeves was there alone, setting up mats, dragging them one at a time into neat rows across the gym floor. He looked up when she came in, a faint line of sweat already on his brow from the effort. "Addie," he said, surprised, straightening up. "I didn't expect to see you today." "I needed somewhere to clear my head," she admitted. "Is that okay?" "Of course." He gestured to the mats, wiping his hands on his shorts. "Practice doesn't start for another hour. Feel free." Addie stepped onto the mat and, without really thinking about it, began moving through a slow form, the kind her father had taught her when she was still small enough to sit on his shoulders after practice, tired and happy-smelling like the gym floor and whatever her mother had cooked for dinner, waiting at home. Reeves watched from across the room, pretending to organize a stack of practice pads while his eyes kept drifting back to her, and something in the shape of her movements, the particular bend of her knee before a turn, the exact angle of her wrist during a block, a small, habitual pause before each transition that most instructors would have corrected out of a student, but that this one clearly hadn't wanted corrected, made his chest tighten with a recognition he still couldn't fully explain. "Where did you say your father taught you?" he asked, once she'd finished setting the pads down. Addie wiped a bit of sweat from her forehead with the back of her wrist. "Ridgeview," she said. "Small town about 4 hours from here. He ran a community program there for years." Reeves nodded slowly, his face carefully unreadable, though something behind his eyes had gone very still. "Was his name Walter?" Addie went still herself, her hand pausing halfway through wiping her forehead. "How did you know that?" Reeves let out a long breath and sat down heavily on the edge of the mat as though the question had physically knocked something loose in him, some weight he'd been carrying without realizing how heavy it had gotten. "I trained with your father," he said, "a long time ago, Before either of us had families, before either of us had much of anything, really, except a mat and an instructor who worked us harder than we thought we could handle. We came up together, under the same instructor, a man named Sensei Oka, for though I doubt that name means anything to you. Best partner I ever had on the mat. He shook his head slowly, a small, sad smile crossing his face, the smile of a man remembering someone he'd loved in the particular, uncomplicated way young men love their closest friends. I heard what happened to him. Years later, long after we'd lost touch. I never got the chance to say I was sorry.
I've thought about that more than you'd probably guess.
Addie's eyes filled, though she blinked hard against it, not wanting to cry in a gymnasium in front of a man she'd known for exactly 10 minutes. He talked about a friend from his training days sometimes, she said. He never mentioned a name, just said he'd trained with someone who pushed him harder than anyone else ever had.
We lost touch.
Reeves admitted, his eyes drifting to some middle distance, some memory neither of them could see. Careers, families, all of it. The way it happens to everyone, eventually, even the people you swear you'll never lose touch with. I always meant to reach out again, send a letter, make a call, something. I just never did. And then one day it felt like too much time had passed to explain why I hadn't.
He studied her, now really studied her, the way a man studies a photograph he hasn't looked at in years.
Is that why you got the scholarship here? Did someone recommend you? Addie frowned slightly, sitting down across from him now. I got a letter last spring, she said. An anonymous donor covering tuition. The school never told me who. Reeves was quiet a long moment, his hands resting on his knees, and when he finally spoke, his voice had gone lower, rougher around the edges. That was me, he finally said. I saw your name on an application list the admissions office shared with faculty advisors last year. Holloway. Didn't think much of it at first. There are plenty of Holloways in this world until I saw your hometown listed, Ridgeview. His voice softened further. I couldn't be sure it was you. I almost convinced myself it wasn't, that it was just a coincidence, easier that way. But I couldn't let it go either. So I made a call. Set up the scholarship anonymously through the athletic department's community fund, the same fund we used to send equipment to programs like the one your father ran. Addie sat down slowly across from him, stunned, her hands going still in her lap. You've been watching out for me this whole time, she said, and you never said anything. Wasn't sure how, Reeves admitted, rubbing the back of his neck. And honestly, I didn't want to make things complicated for you. Didn't want you feeling like you owed some stranger something before you'd even started your first semester. Figured you'd find your own way. Your father raised you to. He paused, his jaw tightening. I heard about the hearing Friday. News travels fast on this campus, Addie said, half a smile crossing her face despite everything, the first real smile she'd managed in days. It does, Reeves said grimly, all humor draining from his voice. Addie, listen to me. Whatever happened in that parking lot, I believe you without a single doubt in my mind. And I'm going to help however I can. I know people here. I know how this school works better than most 20 years of faculty meetings will teach a man things he never wanted to know. Thank you, Addie said quietly. I don't even know what to say. Say you'll let me help, Reeves said. Your father saved my life once, years ago, in a training accident most people don't even know about. A story I'll tell you sometime, when you're ready to hear it. I owe him more than a scholarship. I owe him this. Addie nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat, her eyes glassy but her composure holding, the way she'd been taught composure could hold, even through the hardest things. For the first time since the parking lot, since the complaint, since the number 5 days had started ticking down in her head like something counting toward a deadline she couldn't control, something like hope settled into her chest, small but real. She wasn't as alone in this as she'd feared. That evening, walking back toward her dorm as the sky faded into early dusk, a young woman approached Addie near the quad, moving quickly, glancing over her shoulder more than once,
her arms wrapped around herself as though warding off a cold that wasn't entirely about the weather.
"Addie Holloway?" the girl asked, her voice low, almost swallowed by the wind picking up across the open lawn.
Addie stopped studying her. She recognized the face vaguely, someone she'd seen around campus, maybe a sophomore, though they'd never spoken, someone who usually kept to the edges of rooms the way Addie herself often did.
"Yes,"
Addie said carefully.
"Can I help you?" "My name is Marlene," the girl said. "Marlene Voss. Can we talk somewhere private?"
Something in her tone, tight and urgent, made Addie nod at once.
"Sure," she said. "There's a bench past those trees over there."
They walked together, Marlene glancing around the whole way as though checking that nobody followed her steps, quick and small. Once they sat, Marlene took a shaky breath, her hands pressed flat against her knees like she was trying to hold something steady inside herself.
"I heard about what happened," she said, "with Dawson. The hearing."
Addie's chest tightened.
"What do you know about it?"
Marlene looked down at her hands, twisting them in her lap now, her knuckles pale.
"Last year," she began, barely above a whisper, "Dawson did something similar to me. Not exactly the same, but similar enough that when I heard your name this week, I couldn't just sit there and do nothing."
Addie waited, letting the silence give the girl room, the way she'd learned to give silence room, understanding that some things could only be said if you didn't rush them.
"He cornered me outside a party," Marlene said. "Grabbed my arm, wouldn't let go, said some awful things when I tried to leave, things I still hear sometimes actually late at night when I can't sleep. I fell, hurt my wrist pretty badly, had to wear a brace for 6 weeks. I reported it. To campus security, to the dean's office, all of it, thinking that would be enough, thinking the truth would just be believed because it was true." "What happened?" Addie asked gently.
Marlene's eyes filled now, though her voice stayed even, like she'd rehearsed this in her head many times over the past year, waiting for a chance to finally say it out loud to someone who might actually understand.
"His father showed up," she said, "personally. Met with my parents at our house, not even at the school, like it was some kind of business meeting.
Offered to cover my medical bills. Offered a, quote, generous contribution toward my remaining tuition if I withdrew the complaint and signed something saying I wouldn't discuss it publicly. Called it a resolution, like it was something we were solving together instead of something he was burying." Addie's stomach turned.
"And you signed it?"
"My family isn't wealthy," Marlene said, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand.
My dad had just lost his job that spring. The plant he worked at closed down. That money meant everything to us, meant I could actually stay in school. I felt like I didn't have a choice, like saying no would have been choosing my own pride over my family's stability.
She looked up now, her face a mix of shame and desperate hope, searching Addie's expression for something.
I've regretted it every day since. I should have fought it.
But I was scared and 18, and I didn't know any better, and nobody told me there'd be a cost to staying quiet too.
You weren't stupid, Addie said firmly, reaching over without thinking to steady Marlene's twisting hands. You were scared, and you were protecting your family. That's not the same thing as being stupid. Marlene nodded, though it didn't seem to comfort her much, her chin trembling. I heard about your hearing, she said. And I couldn't just sit back again, not this time. I want to help you. I'll tell them what happened to me if it helps show what kind of person he really is, what his family's really capable of. Addie felt something rise in her chest. Gratitude tangled up with something fiercer, more protective, something that felt almost like the discipline her father had taught her. The same instinct that had put her between Dawson and Junie in that parking lot. Are you sure? She asked. His father could come after you again. Your family. I know, Marlene said, straightening her shoulders slightly, a small, determined set coming into her jaw. But I'm tired of watching him walk around this campus like he owns it, knowing what I know, knowing I let him get away with it once already. I'm done being quiet. I talked to my mom last night. She agrees. She said we should have fought it the first time. Addie reached out and squeezed her hand. Thank you, she said. Really, this could change everything. Marlene managed a small, watery smile, the first hint of something lighter crossing her face.
Let's just hope it's enough, she said. Thursday, the day before the hearing, brought a quiet kind of dread that settled over Addie like fog rolling off a river at dusk, thick and slow and impossible to see through clearly. She met with Coach Reeves and Walt Higgins that morning in a small conference room near the security office, 3 folding chairs pulled around a table scattered with papers, the 3 of them gathering whatever pieces they could before the clock ran out. Walt laid the old newspaper article on the table, smoothing its crease flat with the side of his hand. "This won't prove what happened Friday night," he admitted, "but it'll matter to the board. Trust me, I've sat through enough hearings in my life to know that context matters more than people like to admit. People respect a name like your father's once they understand who he really was." Reeves nodded, arms crossed, his expression tight with concentration. "I've talked to a few faculty members on the disciplinary board," he said, quietly, over coffee, nothing improper. "Can't promise anything, but I've asked them to keep an open mind, reminded a couple of them what kind of favors this family's called in before." "And Marlene's agreed to testify?" Addie added, her voice steadier than she felt. "About what happened to her last year?" Walt's expression darkened. "That takes real nerve," he said, "given what she's up against, given what happened to her the first time she tried." "What about the security footage?" Addie asked the question she'd been circling around all morning. "From the parking lot, has anyone pulled it yet?" Walt hesitated just a beat, but Addie caught it, the small flicker of something crossing his weathered face. "I put in the request Monday," he said. "It should have been ready by now. I'll head over to the security office this afternoon and check on it myself, make sure nothing's fallen through the cracks." Something in his tone knotted her stomach with a worry she couldn't quite name, a small, cold thread winding its way through her chest. That afternoon, Walt walked into the small server room where campus security kept its digital archives, a cramped space lined with humming server racks and a single desk crowded with monitors, greeting the young technician on duty, a student named Casey, who worked part-time managing the system between classes. "I'm here about the Holloway footage request," Walt said. "Science building lot Friday night." Casey frowned, pulling up the request on the screen, scrolling through system logs with quick, practiced keystrokes. "That's weird," Casey said, leaning closer to the monitor. "It shows the file was accessed Tuesday, but there's no footage in the folder now." Something cold settled in Walt's chest, a familiar, unwelcome sensation from decades of cases that had gone sideways in exactly this way. "What do you mean, no footage? I mean, it's gone," Casey said, clicking through folders with growing confusion, his brow furrowing deeper with each empty directory. "The metadata's still here, showing a file existed, showing exactly when it was recorded, but the actual video isn't in the system anymore. Like, someone deleted just the file itself and left the label behind." "Can you recover it?" Walt asked sharply, now the old cop instincts fully awake, his voice taking on an edge Casey hadn't heard from him before. Casey shook his head slowly, chewing his lip. "Not without the backup server, and that's managed off-site by a third-party contractor. I'd have to file a request through them, and that could take days, maybe longer, depending on how backed up their support queue is." "We don't have days," Walt said mostly to himself, staring hard at the empty folder as though it might change its mind. "The hearing's tomorrow." He asked Casey who'd accessed the file Tuesday. The logs showed only an administrative login, generic, untraceable to a single person. Without a deeper audit, they didn't have time to run before tomorrow afternoon. Walt stood there a long moment staring at the empty folder, piecing together what he already suspected, but couldn't yet prove, the shape of it settling into place in his mind the way the shape of a case always eventually settles, whether you want it to or not. Somebody hadn't wanted that footage surviving until Friday. And there was only one family on this campus with the kind of reach to make something like that disappear quietly, cleanly, without leaving fingerprints anywhere an ordinary audit would find them. That evening, Addie sat on her dorm room floor, surrounded by notes, trying to organize everything for tomorrow. Index cards spread across the carpet in careful rows when her phone buzzed with a call from Walt Higgins. She answered right away, her heart already sinking before he'd said a word. Some instinct telling her the news wasn't good. "Mr. Higgins? Did you get the footage?" A pause on the other end, heavy, reluctant, the kind of pause that says more than words will. "Addie," Walt said slowly, "I need you to stay with me here, all right? The footage is gone, deleted from the system sometime Tuesday. We're trying to recover it, but it's not looking good for tomorrow."
The floor seemed to tilt beneath her, the index cards blurring slightly in her vision.
"Gone how?" she asked.
"Cameras don't just erase themselves."
"No," Walt agreed grimly. "They don't." Neither of them said the name out loud, but they both knew exactly who they suspected and exactly how much power that name still carried on this campus, how easily money could reach into a server room and simply erase an inconvenient truth.
"What do we do now?" Addie asked, her voice smaller than she wanted it to be, smaller than she'd let it get all week.
"We fight with what we've got," Walt said firmly, his voice steadying hers through the phone the way a hand on a shoulder might have. "Your father's story, Marlene's testimony, Coach Reeves speaking to your character.
It's not everything we hoped for. But it's not nothing either. I've seen cases won on less."
Addie closed her eyes, trying to steady herself, trying to remember her father's voice, even and unhurried, in moments exactly like this one. A voice that had never once in her memory sounded panicked, no matter what the situation demanded. "You don't need to win every battle to win the war, sweetheart.
You just need to stay standing." "All right," she said quietly, more to herself than to Walt. "We'll be ready."
But hanging up the phone, staring at the small wooden box on her desk, the one holding her father's belt and the old photograph of the two of them, a heavy uncertainty settled into her chest, the kind that doesn't announce itself loudly but simply moves in and stays. That same evening, in a house far grander than any dorm room, its windows glowing warm against the early dark, Dawson Sinclair Sr. sat in his study with a glass of scotch, going over the week in his head, like a man tallying a ledger, satisfied with the sum. The footage was gone. That much was handled. A quiet word to the right vendor, a favor called in from a business contact who owed him more than he'd ever admit publicly, and a problem simply ceased to exist, the way problems always ceased to exist when you knew which doors to knock on and which envelopes to slide beneath them. He'd done this kind of thing before, smaller versions of it, and it had always worked. Money didn't just buy silence, it bought forgetting, which was, in his experience, a far more valuable and permanent thing. His son knocked and let himself in without waiting for an answer, a habit Sinclair Sr. had never corrected because he'd never had to, because correcting it would have meant admitting his son needed correcting at all. "You worried about tomorrow?" Dawson Jr. asked, dropping into the leather chair across the desk, still dressed in the same rumpled shirt he'd worn to bed. "No," his father said, and meant it, swirling the scotch slowly. "By Friday afternoon, this will be a story nobody remembers. By Christmas, these things always blow over. They always have." "And the girl?" Sinclair Sr. watched the light catch in his glass, considering the question with something almost like amusement. "The girl," he said, "will learn what everyone in this town eventually learns, that some names carry further than others, and some don't carry at all." He didn't know yet how wrong he was. He didn't know that somewhere across campus, an old security guard was sitting with a 15-year-old newspaper clipping folded carefully in his jacket pocket, that a coach was calling in a debt owed to a friend he hadn't seen in 20 years, that a sophomore named Marlene Voss had finally decided silence had cost her enough, that a young administrative assistant named Ruth Callahan was about to overhear something in a hallway that would change the shape of everything. He believed quite confidently, sipping his scotch in the warm light of his study, that the matter was closed. Storms that matter most rarely announce themselves before they arrive. Addie didn't sleep much that night. She lay in the dark, listening to the radiator clank its familiar rhythm, listening to Junie's breathing settle into sleep across the room, slow and even. And she thought about her father. Not the version other people knew, the one in the newspaper article. Walt had found the man who'd walked into a burning building twice, brave in the way strangers understood bravery, sudden and dramatic. She thought about the version only she knew. The one who used to kneel down to her level before every lesson, his knees cracking slightly the way knees do after years of kneeling on hard gym floors, and ask the same question every single time, patient as weather.
Why do we train Addie? And she'd answer the way he'd taught her to answer over and over until the words stopped being words and just became something true she carried in her bones, something she could reach for, even now, even 4 hours from home, even with everything on the line. Not to hurt people, to protect what matters, and to know the difference. She thought about Marlene, trembling on that bench, finally choosing to speak after a year of silence, a year of carrying something alone that no 18-year-old should have had to carry alone. She thought about Walt, an old man who didn't have to care about any of this, who could have simply processed the footage request and moved on with his evening, spending his evening chasing down a 15-year-old newspaper article, because something in him refused to let an injustice sit unanswered. She thought about Reeves carrying a debt to a friend he hadn't seen in 20 years, quietly settling it in the only way he knew how, through a scholarship he'd never once mentioned, through showing up now when it mattered most. None of them had to do any of this. That was the thing that kept turning over in her mind as the night wore on, the radiator ticking its slow rhythm beside her. Nobody had asked Walt to dig. Nobody had asked Reeves to help. Nobody had asked Marlene to relive the worst night of her college life in front of strangers, in front of the very family that had once paid her to stay silent. They'd chosen it, all of them, the same way her father had chosen twice to walk back into a burning building for people he'd never met, people who had no claim on him beyond the simple fact that they needed help, and he was there to give it. Maybe that was the part he'd never fully explained to her all those years on the mat, kneeling down to ask his patient question. That discipline wasn't just something you carried alone. It was something that, when it mattered, drew other disciplined people toward you, the way a lit window draws travelers in from the cold, the way one small act of courage seemed to give other people permission to find their own. She finally drifted off sometime past 2 in the morning, her father's belt resting in its box on the desk beside her, the campus outside her window gone dark and still holding its breath for the morning that was coming. A morning that would decide in a handful of hours whether everything her father had taught her would be enough to carry her through. Friday morning came the way important mornings always do. Too fast and too slow all at once. The kind of morning where the clock seems to move strangely, minutes stretching and compressing without any logic to them. Addie woke before her alarm, lying still for a moment in the gray early light, listening to the campus outside slowly coming to life, a delivery truck idling somewhere near the dining hall, a door closing 2 floors below. She stood in front of the small mirror in her dorm room, smoothing down the collar of a plain gray blazer Junie had lent her for the occasion, one Junie had ironed the night before without being asked, laying it carefully over the back of a chair like something ceremonial. Her hands were steady, her stomach was not. "You look ready," Junie said, standing behind her, arms crossed, trying to sound braver than she looked, her own eyes a little red from a short, restless night. "I don't feel ready," Addie admitted. "Nobody ever does," Junie said. "Not for the big stuff. My mom always says that. Feeling ready is for the small stuff." Addie reached for the small wooden box on her desk, opened it, and lifted out her father's belt. She didn't plan to wear it. That wasn't the point. She just needed to hold it a moment, needed to feel the worn fabric under her fingers, needed to remember what it stood for before walking into a room that might try to convince her it stood for nothing. She folded it carefully and placed it inside her bag, tucking it beside her notebook, the way she might tuck away something fragile. "Let's go," she said. The hearing was held in a formal conference room on the 2nd floor of the administration building, tall windows looking out over the quad, where the last of the autumn leaves clung stubbornly to bare branches. A long table at the front where 5 members of the Board of Student Conduct sat, papers spread before them, name placards set neatly in front of each seat. Addie sat on one side, Coach Reeves beside her in a jacket that looked like it hadn't been worn since some faculty ceremony years back. A few rows back sat Walt Higgins,
still in his uniform, having asked his supervisor for the morning off to be there in whatever capacity he could, along with Marlene, who kept twisting a tissue in her hands until it had gone soft and shredded at the edges. Her mother, sitting close beside her, one arm looped protectively through her daughter's. Across the room sat Dawson Sinclair Jr., dressed sharply in a blazer that looked expensive even from a distance, his hair combed with unusual care, his father seated directly behind him, along with the family's attorney, a tall man with silver hair and an expression that suggested the outcome had already been decided in his mind. A leather folder open in front of him, thick with papers. Dean Prentice opened the proceedings, reading the formal complaint aloud in a flat procedural voice, the room listening in silence as she described an alleged assault unprovoked in a parking lot behind the science building 1 week earlier. The language stiff and clinical in a way that seemed to drain the actual night of any of its real texture. When it was his turn, Dawson stood with practiced confidence, describing a version of events that painted Addie as the aggressor, using words like dangerous and trained to hurt people and unprovoked attack, his voice carrying just the right note of wounded dignity, clearly rehearsed, clearly polished by someone more experienced than him in the art of sounding believable. Addie listened, hands folded in her lap, jaw tight but steady, watching him lie with an ease that made something cold settle in her chest. Not fear, exactly, but a kind of quiet astonishment at how smoothly untruth could wear the shape of truth when it was dressed well enough. When her turn came, she stood and told what actually happened, simply, without embellishment. Walking through the lot after the library closed. Seeing Junie frightened his hand on her bag, stepping between them, the punch that never landed. "I never touched him," she said, her voice carrying evenly across the quiet room, steady, even though her heart was working hard beneath her calm exterior. "Not once. I only asked him to stop." The board members exchanged glances, unreadable, a few of them making small notes. Then the family's attorney rose, buttoning his jacket with unhurried precision. "Miss Holloway," he said, his tone smooth, almost gentle, the kind of gentleness that's really a sharper tool in disguise, the sort of voice built for exactly this kind of room. "You claim you didn't touch my client, yet you also admit to 16 years of martial arts training. Isn't it possible a trained fighter simply knows how to make an attack look defensive?" "No," Addie said simply, "because that's not what happened." "But you have no proof of that, do you?" the attorney pressed, taking a small step closer, his voice dropping slightly, drawing the room's attention tighter around him. "No footage, no witnesses beyond your own roommate, whose account one might argue is hardly unbiased." Addie's stomach dropped. He was right, and he knew it, and something in his tone made clear he'd known exactly how this particular gap in their case would land before he'd even opened his mouth. The missing footage sat like an open wound in the middle of their case, and now everyone in the room could see it clearly. "We requested the security footage," Walt Higgins said, standing from the back row, unable to stay quiet, his voice carrying the flat authority of 30 years spent testifying in rooms just like this one. "It was deleted from the system 3 days before this hearing." The attorney turned smoothly toward him, unbothered. "That's a serious accusation, Mr. Higgins. Do you have proof of who deleted it?" Walt's jaw tightened. "Not yet," he admitted. "Then perhaps," the attorney said, turning back to the board with the faint, satisfied air of a man closing a door, "we shouldn't be speculating about missing evidence that may simply be a technical malfunction." Dean Prentice called for order as murmurs rippled through the room, a few board members leaning toward each other to whisper. The board conferred quietly among themselves, Professor Marsh's expression unreadable at the head of the table. Then it was Marlene's turn. She stood slowly, hands trembling so badly the shredded tissue nearly fell from her fingers. Her mother reaching up to squeeze her fingers once before letting go. A small, silent gesture of permission. "Last year," Marlene began, her voice shaking but audible, carrying further into the room than she seemed to expect it to. "Dawson Sinclair grabbed my arm outside a party. I fell, hurt my wrist. I reported it. His father offered my family money to withdraw the complaint. I signed something agreeing not to talk about it. I'm breaking that agreement today because I can't watch this happen to someone else and stay silent again." The room went very still, the kind of stillness that has weight to it. Dawson Sinclair Sr. rose halfway from his seat, his face flushing red, his composure cracking for the first time all morning. "That is a fabrication," he said sharply. "A complete fabrication and frankly slanderous. And I won't sit here and—" "It's not," Marlene said, her voice gaining strength even as tears slid down her cheeks, cutting through his protest with a firmness that surprised even her. "I have the settlement paperwork. I brought a copy today." The board members leaned forward as one, murmuring Professor Marsh requesting to see the document at once, her hand already extended across the table. For the first time since the hearing began, something in Dawson Sinclair Sr.'s composure cracked fully open. He turned toward his attorney, whispering urgently, his hand gripping the back of the chair in front of him hard enough that his knuckles paled. Dean Prentice called for a short recess to review the new document, the room stirring into motion as people rose to stretch, to whisper, to step out for air. Out in the hallway, Marlene's mother, a soft-spoken woman named Diane Voss, stepped away from the crowd to catch her breath near a quiet stairwell, her hand pressed against the cool stone wall. She hadn't expected to see Dawson Sinclair Sr. follow her there, his footsteps quick and deliberate on the tile, his face tight with barely contained fury. "Mrs. Voss," he said, his voice low, controlled in that particular way rich men learn to control their voices when they're used to getting what they want through pressure instead of shouting. A voice built for boardrooms and closed-door negotiations. "I think there's been a terrible misunderstanding today." "I don't think there has," Diane said, backing up slightly, one hand instinctively reaching for the stair railing behind her. "You signed an agreement," Sinclair said, stepping closer, his tone still smooth, still reasonable on its surface, the way a knife can look reasonable right up until it's used. "Your daughter signed an agreement. Breaking that today could have serious consequences for your family, legal consequences. I'd hate for things to get complicated for you, especially with your husband's situation." Diane's face paled, her hand tightening on the railing. "Are you threatening me?" "I'm simply reminding you of the arrangement we made," Sinclair said smoothly. "One that was very generous, if I recall, given the circumstances your family was in at the time." Neither of them noticed a young administrative assistant named Ruth Callahan standing just around the corner, having stepped out for a moment of quiet before heading back to her desk, a stack of hearing paperwork tucked under one arm. Her hand freezing over her phone as the voices carried around the corner. Ruth had worked at Ashworth for 11 years, long enough to have seen 3 different deans come and go, long enough to know most of the quiet arrangements that moved through this building without ever appearing on any official record. She'd seen plenty of privileged families over the years, plenty of quiet arrangements made to smooth over unpleasant situations. She'd always told herself it wasn't her business, that her job was paperwork and scheduling, not moral accounting. But something about the tremble in Diane Voss's voice reminded Ruth sharply of her own daughter, a college sophomore at a school 2 states away, and of every time over the years she'd wished someone, anyone, had stepped in when it mattered, instead of looking the other way. Because looking the other way was easier and safer and asked nothing of you. Her hands shook as she lifted her phone and pressed record, holding it low against her side, angled just enough to catch the voices without drawing attention. She caught the last 30 seconds, enough to hear Sinclair's voice clearly threatening consequences, enough to hear the word arrangement spoken like something still enforceable, still owned by him, the way he seemed to believe he owned most things. Ruth's heart pounded as she slipped back around the corner before either of them noticed her. Her footsteps quick and light on the tile, her breath coming fast. She didn't know yet what she'd do with what she'd just heard. She stood for a moment in an empty side hallway, staring at the small red recording icon still glowing on her screen, her thumb hovering over it. She thought about her daughter. She thought about 11 years of quiet paperwork and looking the other way. She only knew standing there that she couldn't pretend she hadn't heard it, not this time. When the hearing resumed 20 minutes later, the mood in the room had shifted tense in a new way, though most people couldn't have said exactly why. Some subtle current running beneath the surface that even the board members seemed to sense without understanding its source. Ruth sat quietly near the back, having slipped in a few minutes after everyone else, hands folded tightly in her lap, her phone resting heavy in her jacket pocket like a stone she wasn't sure how to set down. Her heart still not fully settled. Dean Prentice called the room to order and asked if there was further testimony before the board moved to deliberation, her gaze sweeping the room, out of habit rather than expectation. That was when Ruth stood. Every head turned toward her, surprised, a small ripple of confusion moving through the room. She wasn't part of the case. Nobody had called her name. She wasn't even sure in that moment that her legs would carry her the rest of the way up. "I have something the board should hear," she said, voice trembling but clear, carrying further than she expected it to. "I recorded it about 20 minutes ago in the hallway outside." Dean Prentice looked startled, glancing quickly toward Professor Marsh. "Ms. Callahan, this is highly irregular." "I know," Ruth said, "but I think it matters. More than following the usual order does right now." The board members exchanged glances, and after a brief hushed conference, heads leaning together, Dean Prentice nodded slowly, though her expression remained uncertain.
"Play it," she said.
Ruth's hands shook as she pressed play, holding her phone toward the small microphone at the witness table so the recording could carry through the room's speaker system, a faint hiss of static preceding the voices. Sinclair's voice filled the room, unmistakable, cold and controlled, every word landing with a weight that seemed to press the air out of the room. "You signed an agreement. Breaking that today could have serious consequences for your family, legal consequences. I'd hate for things to get complicated for you, especially with your husband's situation." The room fell into stunned silence, the kind that seems to actually change the temperature of a space. Diane Voss covered her mouth with both hands, tears spilling now, her shoulders shaking silently. Marlene reached for her mother's arm, holding tight her own face, a mixture of vindication and heartbreak. Dawson Sinclair Sr. shot to his feet, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "This is a violation of privacy," he said, voice rising sharply, his composure fully gone now. "This recording is inadmissible, illegally obtained, and I demand—" "You threatened a grieving mother in a public hallway," Dean Prentice said, her voice suddenly hard as steel, cutting his protest off completely. A tone none of the students in the room had heard from her before. "In a university building, during a disciplinary hearing regarding your own son's conduct." Sinclair opened his mouth to argue further, his face nearly purple now, but the board's chairperson, an older woman named Professor Idalia Marsh, who had said very little all morning, raised her hand for silence, and something in her expression, calm and immovable, made even Sinclair sit back down. "Mr. Sinclair," Professor Marsh said evenly, her voice carrying an authority that needed no volume behind it, "I suggest you allow this hearing to continue without further interruption." The room settled into a heavy, charged quiet, the air still ringing faintly with the echo of the recording. It was in that moment, with the walls seeming to close in around him, with the story he'd built so carefully now crumbling in front of the entire board, that Dawson Sinclair Jr. finally lost whatever thin control he'd been holding on to all morning. He shot up from his chair, his face twisted with humiliation and rage, the careful composure he'd maintained all morning collapsing all at once like something structural finally giving way under too much weight. "This is ridiculous!" he shouted, voice cracking, his hands balling into fists at his sides. "None of this proves anything about what happened in that parking lot. She's the dangerous one, not me. Everyone's just believing whatever she says because of some sob story about her dad." "Dawson, sit down," his father hissed, grabbing at his sleeve, but the boy wasn't listening anymore, some final restraint finally burning through completely. He turned toward Addie, who had risen slightly in her chair, watching him carefully, the same way she'd watched him a week earlier under the flickering parking lot light. Her body already settling, without her conscious direction, into the same balanced readiness it had found that night. "You did this,"
he said, stepping around the table, closing the distance faster than anyone expected, his voice raw now, stripped of all its earlier polish. "You ruined everything. My scholarship, my reputation, everything. And for what? Because I said something you didn't like? Dawson, stop!" Coach Reeves called out, half rising from his seat, his hand shooting out, though he was too far to reach him. But Dawson didn't stop. Whatever restraint had kept him seated all morning snapped completely, and he lunged forward, fist raised, aiming straight for Addie right there in front of the entire board, in front of witnesses, in front of everyone who might have still doubted what kind of person he really was. This time, there was no darkness to hide behind, no alcohol to blur the memory afterward, no parking lot shadows to blame it on, no story he could rewrite later in a locker room to a crowd of nodding teammates. Just 5 members of a disciplinary board and a room full of witnesses watching everything unfold in the plain, honest light of a Friday afternoon, the kind of light that leaves nothing shadowed, nothing deniable. Addie moved. Not with anger, not with fear, with 16 years of discipline, exactly the way her father had taught her, exactly the way she'd practiced 1,000 times on a mat back home in Ridgeview, her body responding before her mind had finished registering the threat, the way training is meant to work when it's been built deeply enough into a person. She stepped slightly to the side, redirecting the force of his swing, her hand catching his wrist and turning it gently, but firmly, guiding his own momentum against him until he found himself off balance, one knee bending toward the floor, his arm pinned at an angle that hurt just enough to stop him without breaking anything, without causing any real harm at all. A control so precise it seemed almost gentle, which somehow made it more unsettling to watch than violence would have been. It was over in under 2 seconds. Dawson knelt there breathing hard, stunned, his face burning with a humiliation far deeper than anything from the dining hall weeks earlier. The entire board, watching him kneel powerless in front of the girl he'd spent a month calling weak. "I'm not hurting you," Addie said quietly, still holding his wrist steady, her voice even, almost gentle. "I'm just going to hold you here until you stop." The room stayed frozen, every eye locked on the scene in front of them, nobody quite breathing. Slowly, Addie released his wrist and stepped back, hands open, empty, non-threatening, exactly as they'd been the moment before he lunged. Dawson stayed on the floor a moment longer, gasping, before Marcus, one of his own teammates who'd come to observe quietly, helped him back to his chair, avoiding his eyes. Professor Marsh sat very still at the front table, her expression unreadable, though her eyes had never left Addie's hands through the entire encounter, tracking every motion with the sharp focus of someone who understood exactly what she'd just witnessed. "That," she finally said, breaking the silence, her voice quiet but carrying to every corner of the room, "was remarkably controlled." Addie said nothing. She returned to her seat, breathing, steady hands folded once more exactly as they'd been before any of it happened, as though the whole encounter had barely touched her. Professor Marsh called for another recess, longer this time, giving the board room to gather itself after what everyone had just watched, the room slowly emptying into the hallway in small, murmuring clusters. During the break, Walt approached the front table, quietly waiting until Professor Marsh had a free moment, her assistant having stepped away to fetch water. "Ma'am," he said, "there's something you should know about Addie's family." He handed her the folded newspaper article he'd carried in his jacket pocket for 2 days, the creases soft now from handling. Professor Marsh unfolded it slowly, eyes scanning the headline, the photograph, the details of the fire, the rescue, the 8 lives saved, her reading glasses sliding slightly down her nose. Her expression changed as she read something, softening in the deep lines around her eyes, a memory clearly surfacing behind them. "Holloway," she murmured. "I remember something about this. I lived 2 towns over from Ridgeview years ago before I came here, before my husband's job brought us out this way. I think I even remember reading about this fire in the local paper at the time." She looked up at Walt. "This officer, is this her father?" "Yes, ma'am," Walt confirmed. Professor Marsh sat back slowly, absorbing that something shifting behind her eyes, the article resting in her hands like something she suddenly understood the full weight of.
When the hearing resumed, the room felt different than it had that morning, heavier in some ways, lighter in others, the way a room feels once the truth has finally been let all the way in, once there's nothing left hidden in the corners. Professor Marsh cleared her throat and addressed the room, waiting until every seat had settled and every eye had turned toward her. "Before we move to deliberation," she said, "I'd like to share something. Not as evidence directly related to today's incident, but as context I believe matters, and that I think this board and everyone in this room deserves to hear." She held up the clipping. 15 years ago, she continued, an officer named Walter Holloway ran into a burning apartment building not once but twice, saving 8 lives, including 6 children, while waiting for fire crews delayed by a downed power line. He also spent years teaching free self-defense classes to children in his community who couldn't otherwise afford them. She paused, letting the words settle over the room, letting them land the way she intended them to. "I only just learned," she went on, "that Officer Holloway was Miss Holloway's father. He passed away several years ago in the line of duty." A murmur moved through the room, quiet, respectful, a few heads turning toward Addie with new expressions. "I share this," Professor Marsh said, "not because it excuses or explains anything that happened here today. It doesn't need to. Miss Holloway's actions today and last Friday speak entirely for themselves, more clearly than any family story ever could." She looked at Addie now, something close to admiration in her expression. "But I think it's worth understanding what 16 years of discipline under the guidance of a man like that can actually produce." She turned to the rest of the board, her voice gaining a firmness that filled the room. "I've sat on this committee for 11 years, she said. "I have never seen restraint like what we witnessed today under direct physical threat inside this very room. That is not the behavior of someone dangerous. That is the behavior of someone extraordinarily well-trained, choosing not to cause harm even when harm would have been justified." Nobody in the room argued with her. The board's deliberation took less than 20 minutes, though it felt to everyone waiting outside the closed conference room doors considerably longer. When they returned and everyone had resettled, Professor Marsh read the decision aloud, her voice formal and steady once more, cutting cleanly through the tense hush. "After careful review of all testimony and evidence presented today," she said, "this board finds no basis for disciplinary action against Miss Adeline Holloway. Furthermore, given the evidence presented regarding a prior incident involving Mr. Dawson Sinclair, Jr., and given his conduct displayed here today, this board recommends immediate suspension, pending further investigation, including possible referral to local law enforcement." Dawson sat frozen in his chair, pale, his father beside him gripping the edge of the table so tightly his knuckles had gone white. His silver-haired attorney closing his leather folder with a quiet, defeated click. "Additionally," Professor Marsh continued, "given the serious allegations of interference regarding evidence in this case and the recorded incident of witness intimidation heard today, this matter will be referred to the university's Board of Trustees for review of Mr. Sinclair Sr.'s continued position on that board." The room fell into stunned, heavy silence, broken only by the faint sound of Diane Voss quietly crying against her daughter's shoulder, tears of relief now, rather than fear. Sinclair Sr. rose slowly, his face a mixture of fury and disbelief, opening his mouth as though to protest before seeming to realize, perhaps for the first time in a long while, that his name alone wasn't going to fix this, that the ledger he'd been tallying so confidently the night before had just been overturned entirely. He said nothing. He simply gathered his things, gripped his son's arm, and walked out, the attorney trailing silently behind them both, the heavy doors swinging shut on a scene that would be the last time either Sinclair walked into that building with the same standing they'd walked in with that morning. The days that followed moved quickly, the way things often do once the truth finally breaks free after being held back too long, the momentum of it carrying everything forward faster than anyone quite expected. Dawson Sinclair Jr. was formally suspended, and word spread that criminal charges were being considered both for the parking lot incident and the outburst witnessed by the entire board, an investigation that would, in the following weeks, uncover 2 more incidents involving other students that had never been formally reported at all. His father resigned from the Board of Trustees within the week before the university could formally remove him. A quiet admission dressed up as a personal decision in a brief statement released to the campus newspaper. The gold lettering above the library entrance quietly scheduled for replacement by spring.
Marlene Voss received a formal apology from the university, along with an offer to have her original complaint properly investigated more than a year late. But not too late to finally matter her mother's medical bills from the original injury finally covered, without any conditions attached this time. Other students, emboldened by what they had heard, began coming forward too. Smaller stories, quieter injustices that had been swept aside for years by a family used to buying silence. The full picture, once it assembled itself over the following month, was larger and darker than most of campus had realized. A pattern, years in the making, finally seeing daylight all at once. Ruth Callahan received a quiet note of thanks from Dean Prentice, along with a small commendation added to her personnel file, and though she never sought recognition for what she'd done, brushing off compliments from coworkers for weeks afterward, something had shifted in her that week too. A reminder that speaking up, even frightened, even inconvenient, still matters more than staying comfortable ever could.
Peter Doyle, the freshman, who'd stayed quiet in the locker room weeks earlier, found Addie outside the library one afternoon and apologized for not saying something sooner. She told him it was all right that most people needed a reason before they found their courage, and that he'd found his in time to matter. He joined the karate club the following week. 2 weeks later, on a crisp November afternoon, the university's small karate club gathered in their gymnasium for what Coach Reeves had quietly organized as a modest ceremony. Addie stood near the front, Junie beside her, Walt Higgins, present in his security jacket, standing a little straighter than usual, having been invited specifically by Reeves with a phone call the previous week. Marlene and her mother had come too, sitting near the back with matching relieved expressions, along with several club members and even Dean Prentice. And Professor Marsh had stopped by for a few minutes between meetings, standing quietly near the doorway. Reeves stepped forward, holding a small glass display case in his hands, the kind usually reserved for trophies, though nothing inside it that afternoon had been won on any mat. "This club has a long tradition," he said, addressing the small, gathered crowd, his voice carrying easily across the gym. "Every year we recognize something that matters beyond trophies and rankings. This year, we wanted to recognize discipline. Real discipline. The kind that doesn't announce itself, doesn't seek attention, but holds steady, exactly when it matters most." He turned to Addie. "With her permission," he continued, "we'd like to display something in this case as a reminder for every student who walks through these doors." Addie stepped forward and, with careful hands, placed her father's old black belt inside the case, the worn fabric catching the gymnasium's fluorescent light, the faded stitching still legible after all these years. The soda stain from that first day in the dining hall long since faded from the fabric, but not somehow from her memory of it. D. Holloway. Reeves closed the case gently and turned it so the small brass plaque beneath it caught the light. The Holloway Belt, Discipline over Anger. In memory of Officer Walter Holloway and in honor of everyone who chooses restraint when the world expects rage. The room stayed quiet for a long moment, nobody quite ready to be the first to move. Then, slowly, people began to clap. Not loudly, not for show, just a steady, warm sound filling the small gymnasium, gathering strength, the way applause sometimes does when it comes from genuine feeling rather than obligation. Junie wiped her eyes, smiling despite the tears. Marlene squeezed her mother's hand. Walt gave a small, respectful nod from the back of the room, the kind of nod one person gives another when words feel unnecessary, the kind 2 men who'd worn a badge might exchange without needing to explain why. Addie stood in front of the case, a long moment looking at her father's belt resting safely behind the glass, hearing his voice again, steady and warm from all those years of practice on a small mat back home. His knees cracking as he knelt down to her level, patient as weather. Why do we train, Addie? Not to hurt people, to protect what matters, and to know the difference. She finally understood, standing there surrounded by people who had each chosen in their own way to stand up when it would have been easier to stay quiet, what her father had really been teaching her all those years. It was never about the punches she could throw. It was about the ones she chose not to. Outside, the November afternoon had turned golden, the kind of soft autumn light that makes even an ordinary campus feel worth remembering. The kind of light that seemed that particular afternoon to fall a little more gently than usual. Addie walked out of the gymnasium with Junie beside her, the weight of these past few weeks finally beginning to lift off her shoulders, her steps lighter than they'd been in a month.
You know,
Junie said, looping her arm through Addie's, when I first heard someone call you princess in that dining hall, I thought it was the meanest thing I'd ever heard. Addie smiled faintly. It wasn't exactly kind. No, Junie agreed, but it's funny actually thinking about it now, because in the end, you never needed him to take it back.
you just needed to keep being exactly who you already were.
Addie considered that as they walked, the golden light catching the edges of fallen leaves scattered across the quad, crunching softly underfoot. My dad used to say something like that, she said quietly. He said the people who try hardest to make you feel small are usually the ones most afraid of how big you actually are.
Junie smiled. Sounds like he was a smart man.
He was, Addie said. He still is in a way. I carry him with me every single day. They walked on together past the library, its gold lettering catching the last of the afternoon sun, past the quad where all of it had begun weeks earlier, the campus around them settling slowly into evening, warm lights glowing in windows, one by one, the whole world quietly, steadily moving forward, the way it always does, carrying its people along with it toward whatever comes next. Behind them, inside a small glass case and a university gymnasium, an old black belt caught the last light of the day. A quiet reminder to everyone who passed it that true strength rarely shouts. Sometimes it simply stands still and waits and refuses to break. And sometimes, in the end, that is more than enough.